Hello and welcome friends. This is second lecture on Machiavelli and today we are going to focus on his advice to the prince. So, the main focus of today's lecture would be his advice to the prince, and based on the text which is widely read and the basis of characterization of Machiavelli as a theorist who justified immoral, treacherous action in the politics. So, today's lecture will be focused on the prince, the advice that he gives to the prince and how to rule the principality or the polity effectively, how to preserve them and how to defend them given the fact that the men are treacherous, wicked and evil. So, given this understanding of human nature or prevalence of evil all around, how to establish a rule and then to govern them effectively is the central concern of the prince that we are going to focus today. And if you recall, in the previous lecture we have located Machiavelli in the political and the intellectual context, where there was a kind of shift away from the religious thinking or the Christian ideology of politics as impermanent, imperfect, to the transcendental, which is the religious, and men should submit to the will of God and so on. So, in the Machiavelli there was a kind of decisive shift and assertion of politics as an autonomous or a domain with its own set of morality and ethics. We have also discussed how he define virtue and how fortuna or fortuna play a decisive role in the human affairs, even when human beings are or the rulers are having the necessary virtue to rule the polity or to rule the principalities. So, in Machiavelli's conception of virtue is very different from the Christian ethics of virtue or the Greco-Roman understanding of virtuous action. Machiavelli defines it in a more ethical, neutral or morally neutral sense, where it requires the ability to know the moment and what is the appropriate action to respond to that particular moment, and that requires a ruler to be bold, to have temperance or the necessary foresight to intuitively understand the exact nature of the moment and then respond to that accordingly. So, it is a kind of value neutral understanding of virtue, and that gives the ruler to limit the influence or the decisive role that fortuna play in the human affairs. So, the other half would be the role of fortuna and the other half would be the virtue that the prince or the ruler can develop or inculcate in the citizenry. So, this we have discussed in the previous lecture. In the concluding lecture, we will focus more on his idea of republicanism or how to rule a republic and how citizen can play a decisive role in governing the city or the state by developing what he calls civic virtue. So, that is based on his text discourses, and then we will conclude Machiavelli's contribution to political thought and political theorization in Western tradition. So, today our focus is mainly on his text The Prince and the advice he gave to the prince to rule the principality more effectively given the nature of human beings who are treacherous, evil and sinful. Okay, so, in Machiavelli then what we have is a kind of new theory of politics, and politics for him is not about ethical or philosophical speculation and contemplation, but it is about basically the preservation and the security of the state, and that we can understand by the historical context of Machiavelli, where there was a lot of instability, upheavals or insecurities in the republics of Italian peninsula, and there was constantly subjected to external aggression by Spain or France and other states. So, for Machiavelli then, the main role of politics or knowledge of politics is the preservation and the security of a state, which would ensure the safety and welfare of the people. So, the welfare and the safety of the people is unimaginable without a secured state which is governed effectively. So, the role of politics for Machiavelli is then to preserve the state, to defend the state, to secure its order. So, in the Prince he provides all the advice to the ruler which is necessary to preserve and defend his principalities and thereby ensuring the welfare of the people. So, the welfare of the people is connected with the welfare or the security of the state. So, the main concern for Machiavelli is to advise the ruler in statecraft where they can ensure the security of the state and thereby welfare of the people. So, the security and the welfare of the people is not disconnected with the security of the state. So, in a secure state only human beings can live a safe life and their welfare can be secured. If the state is subjected to external aggression, automatically the lives of the individual and their welfare is also subjected to those changes or instabilities. So, in the Prince, Machiavelli provide those advice which is necessary for the prince to rule their principalities effectively, defend it from the external aggression and also from the conspiracies within, and thereby ensure the safety and the welfare of the people. So, his theory of politics is based on this wickedness, evil and inherently violent nature of the man, and this understanding of human nature is there in Christian ethics also. So, we have discussed how Saint Augustine or Thomas Aquinas argued that human nature is innately immoral or bad, and on its own through their reason or intellect they cannot achieve redemption. So, for that they must subject to the will of the God. Machiavelli shared that understanding of human nature as wicked, sinful, evil and inherently violent, which result in the political instabilities and upheavals, and Italian cities or the principalities were constantly subjected to such kind of political instabilities and upheavals. Even Machiavelli, his personal life is also suffered or influenced by such political instabilities. So, he based his theory or advice to the prince on this basis of human nature, which is in wicked, evil or inherently violence, and of course, he does not go into the details of human nature as we find in Hobbes and other thinkers, but his prime concern was not to define what is good or bad for the individual, but how to ensure the security of the state, the preservation of the rule, and once the security and the preservation of the rule is maintained, the human beings life and their welfare can also be secured. So, the primary concern for Machiavelli is to preservation of the state and its defense. So, given this nature of the man, the challenge for Machiavelli was therefore to advise the rulers how to establish their rule and govern them effectively. So, that is the major concern of Machiavelli. The prince generated a complex debate in a Western political tradition or political philosophy, which was much beyond the immediate context in which this text was written. So, in the Prince, Machiavelli also expressed his patriotism to unify the Italy and to bring back the classical Roman republican form of government. So, the immediate context of writing Prince was about unification of Italy, and also we have to take into account that with the Prince, Machiavelli was trying to rejoin the active life of politics. So, he regarded the writing or the philosophical speculation subordinated to the active life in the politics, and he write this text, the Prince, and dedicate it to the young prince of Medici family, the former ruler of Italy, who returned after the upheavals or the external aggression with the support of Pope and also Spanish monarchy. And the young prince Lorenzo, he wrote this text and dedicate it to him with the hope that it will allow him to re-enter the politics. So, the new ruler of Italy will grant him the opportunity to rejoin the active politics of Florence or Italy. So, this text then is written in the immediate context of Italian politics and the real pragmatic politics to which Machiavelli had earlier experience and wanted to rejoin. However, in the Western political thinking and theorization, such immediate context is not really taken as seriously as his imagination or his characterization as the theorist of evil. So, the brand of Machiavellian politics is associated with the treacherous life or anything that is immoral, unethical, treacherous, dubious in nature, and many tyrants or the politicians draw lessons from this text, the Prince, out of its context in which it was written, where there was the constant warfare between different principalities, there were political instabilities and upheavals. In that context, Machiavelli is trying to create an order, establish a rule and govern them effectively. So, who is going to do that, and what is the necessary advice to rule that principality effectively is the concern of Machiavelli, which he expressed in this text. So, when we theorize or interpret this text, we need to keep into the consideration the context in which it was written, which is often taken out of context, and then we characterize Machiavelli with everything that is dubious, evil and immoral. So, he was a pragmatist and ruthless realist, and yet he acknowledged the role of fortuna in human affairs, and he argued that virtue could help mitigate its influence or devastating influence, but could not tame it completely. So, this point which we have discussed earlier, that the fortuna will play a role and in fact decisive role in the fate of human affairs or the human life or in the life of the rulers. So, no matter how much virtue or how much courageous or foresight a king or a ruler is, the fortuna will have its role to play. And how it plays we discussed in the previous lecture. So, here one has to understand that despite being a pragmatist or a realist thinker, Machiavelli acknowledged the role of fortuna or how virtue can limit the role of fortuna, and yet the fortuna will decide the fate of the ruler, fate of the principalities and so on, and that is a kind of circular understanding of human nature or the polity or the government. So, Machiavelli had acknowledged the role of such fortuna as well, and we will see today in the lecture how he also acknowledged the role of religion in governing the city effectively. So, surprisingly Machiavelli wanted politics to have its distinct set of morality and vehemently opposed Christianity, which he associated with corruption and moral decay in Italy. So, everything that is immoral or corrupt about Italian life, he associated with Christianity. And as we have discussed in his political intellectual context, that the Christian ethics or Christian morality did not provide enough motivation for the subject or for the ruler to govern their principality effectively. There was the moral or political degeneration all around, which resulted in the fragmentation of the polity or the republics. So, the reason for that is the inability of the Christian ethics or the morality to provide enough motivation to the rulers. So, there was the kind of all around moral political corruption and degeneration, which Machiavelli associate with the a Catholic Church or Christianity, and yet he recognized the role of religion in politics, and he thereby understand the political role of religion not something which is good in itself, or not something which gives the absolute truth to the individual or to the seeker, as Christianity believed, but for Machiavelli it has a role in politics, and he wanted it to be subordinated to the objectives of the state. So, a ruler or a wise ruler must know how to use the religion for the political purpose, to ensure obedience among the masses. So, he argued about two sets of morality, that is public and private, and it is good for the stability of the rule if the large section of the population follows the conventional morality and the Christian ethics. It will allow them to obey the rule and thereby in the sustenance of the kingdom. In the Prince, Machiavelli first make a distinction between different kinds of rule, and the two chief form of ruling a city or a polity is the principalities, or a kind of monarchy where the one person rule the city effectively, and the other is republics where the citizens themselves through their senate or representative govern the city. He discussed the republican form of government in discourses, the another text of Machiavelli which we will discuss in the next lecture. In the Prince, he deals with different types of principalities and how to secure them and govern them effectively is the major concern of this text, the Prince. So, first he set out to describe different types of principalities that exist in the Italian peninsula, and these are hereditary principalities where the prince or the monarchy inherit the rule from their fathers or their forefathers and so on. Then there was the mixed principalities where is the combination of the monarchy, aristocracy and also the popular form of rule in the form of democracy or polyarchy or any other terms that may use for the popular form of government. So, there is also principalities where one person is the ruler, but the effective rule is the combination of all the three elements of monarchy, aristocracy and the popular democracy. There is also new principalities, and he focused more on the new principalities than the hereditary, mixed or other form of principalities, and he prefer that the scope for glory and to achieve something really rewarding is more available to a new prince than the one who inherit or the one who is the existing ruler of a principality. So, he add more premium to those who are new in the ruling. And the other forms of principality was the civic principalities or ecclesiastical principality, which is like papacy, the pope ruling the principalities where there is no really effective rule, nor the population want to be governed effectively, and yet they obey the pope or the papacy who are least concerned about the effective governing and govern in the name of God or being representative of God and so on. So, there are different kinds of principalities that was there, but he argued that there is a greater scope for glory for the new prince or new principalities, and in the rest of the prince he argues that how to acquire new position or to acquire a principalities and govern them effectively, and that is where he is actually somewhat different from other kind of political thinkers in Western tradition, where he allows political thinking and theorization not on the basis of inheritance or not on the basis of nobility of birth. He actually wanted a ruler or the prince should be the man of the masses, that is to say that he gives an analogy of a painter. So, to have a proper perspective or a coverage of different kind of landscapes, a good painter should have the access to the top from where he or she can see the below or the valley, and he should also have access in the valley so that he can see the heights of the mountains. he makes a similar kind of advice to the prince, where he should be in a position to see things below, but also he should live among the masses or among the people to know about the princes or the actions of the princes. So, this analogy of a new prince or an effective prince who can attain glory is something very unique in Machiavellian thought and imagination, and we will see later on also that how he advised the prince to seek friendship among the masses, not with the nobility and the aristocracy who will constantly conspire, who will constantly set traps for him. So, for the sustenance of his rule or the long term rule, he must seek friendship with the common masses. So, Machiavelli argues that there is a greater scope for glory to the new prince than the existing or the hereditary prince, and the single most concern, as I have told, for Machiavelli in the prince is not to take a moral ethical position on the nature of the polity. So, unlike in Aristotle classification of a state, where we have seen that how he characterized the constitution on the basis of ideal type or perverted type, and this classification of ideal and perverted is based on certain moral judgment, certain standard. So, the monarchy is ideal because it is in the interest of everyone, but tyranny is not, because it is interest of the ruler. So is the aristocracy, oligarchy, polity and democracy. So, there is a kind of ethical, moral position in the classification of the constitution in Aristotle. In contrast to that, Machiavelli do not take any moral ethical position while describing what different kind of principalities. His major concern was preserving the principalities and rule them effectively, and he considered the new prince more capable of ruling effectively than the and having a scope of achieving the glory than the existing or the hereditary rule and certainly the ecclesiastical principalities. So, his stance is morally and ethically neutral, and his concern is entirely focused on the preservation and the sustenance of existing principalities. So, in the concluding chapter we will see that Machiavelli's Florentine patriotism becomes much more clear when where he advised the future prince on how to unify Italy and re-establish the glory of classical Roman Republic. So, that is the overall objective desire of Machiavelli in his advice to prince or the future ruler who would unify the Italy, who were fragmented into different principalities and were at constant war with each other, and the external forces interfere in the matters of Italian city states or governing the city states. So, now we will move on to understand what are the advices that Machiavelli gave to the prince. So, first advice that he gives to the prince is that he should have the knowledge of history, and Machiavelli himself understood the role of history in having the correct understanding of the situation and also to respond to them. So, according to Machiavelli, history provides a storehouse of great achievements to imitate and a gallery of great men to emulate. So, a prince must learn from the history, which is a storehouse of great achievements which was achieved in the past and the great rulers also. So, a prince must in his governing or ruling the principalities learn lesson from the past, and the knowledge of the past is necessary for a ruler to govern effectively. So, for a ruler to preserve his rule, it is critical to understand ever changing events in politics and to seize it by responding to them appropriately. It may seem commonsensical to us that a ruler should understand what is the situation, what is the necessity in the given situation, and how to effectively respond to that situation. Now, in the political life of the nation state, even today you will find that the leaders often fail to understand what is the situation, what is the demand of the situation and how to respond to them effectively. So, as I have discussed in the previous lecture, that for the human being and also for the rulers, it is easy to reflect upon the past and predict about the future. The toughest and the hardest thing is to understand the present, which is constantly at flux. And now in such ever changing situation, it is necessary for the ruler to understand what exactly is the situation and how one should respond to them effectively. A ruler who understands the situation and also how to understand to that effectively becomes the great. They achieve the glory for himself and for his principalities, and if he or she fails, then it brings doom or calamities for his rule and also for his principalities. So it was absolutely necessary to understand the moment and also to respond to them appropriately. Failing in this ability could be disastrous for the king and his kingdom. So the king or the ruler must know when to be kind or generous and when to be ruthless. So it is in contrast to the Christian conventional morality or the advice of the rulers like Cicero or the philosophers like Cicero, that a ruler must be honest and truthful in all the context. Machiavelli advised the ruler to know when to be kind or generous and when to be ruthless. For example, if a ruler is too generous with the people, then when there is the time of say drought or situation of scarcity, he will not have enough resources to be generous when the situation demands. So he wanted the ruler to be economical, to be knowledgeable of when to become kind or generous and when to become the ruthless. And again this knowledge of determining or deciding when to become generous and when to become kind comes from the understanding of history. So these lessons he could learn only from the examples from the past rulers, where there are examples of many rulers ruining their empire or principalities because of their over generousness or over kindness, which resulted in envy or the conspiracies and upheavals from the aristocracy or the nobilities. So a ruler must know how to balance or how to behave generously in a particular situation and ruthlessly in the other situation, depending upon the necessity or the requirement of the situation. So there is no kind of a priori ethical and moral position for the ruler in Machiavellian theory of politics. So without that knowledge of being when to be generous and when to be ruthless, a ruler is bound to fail in preserving his rule and defending his principalities. So he despised the contemporary rulers in Italy for not caring about and learning lessons from the past. So one of the criticism that Machiavelli had about the rulers of his time was they were not knowledgeable in the history and thereby do not draw lessons from the history, which is necessary for a ruler to govern his principalities effectively. However, this interest in history in Machiavelli is not that of a historian's attention to detail or the correctness of the fact. For him, the role of history for a ruler is to draw lesson to respond to the unfolding situation in the present, and not to be concerned about the accuracy or the correctness of the interpretation or the facts of the history, as that is the role of historians. Now the other advice that he gives to the prince is the knowledge of warfare, and military virtue is something which he regarded absolutely necessary for the effective rule of the principalities. So Machiavelli was well aware of the military weakness of Italy of his time, which resulted in internal fragmentation and warfare within and aggression from the external forces. So the situation in Italy when Machiavelli was thinking or writing this text was constant warfare and political instabilities, constant fighting within among different principalities, and also the interference from the external forces. And on top of that, there was a Catholic Church which was confined to their pleasure or pomps and pleasures without really bothering about governing or ensuring the governing of the city. So, they were more about lavish life and enjoying the pleasure, and there was the corruption all around, and all the corruption and political military degeneration of Italy, therefore Machiavelli associated with the church. So, he regarded the military weakness as the reason for the fragmentation or political instabilities in Italy, and he wanted the rulers to have both political as well as military virtue. And according to Machiavelli, it was the lack of military virtue that Roman republics or principalities could not defend itself from the external aggressions and internal warfares. So, he writes that a ruler should have no other objectives and no other concern, nor occupy himself with anything else except war and its method and practices, for this pertains only to those who rules. So, for a ruler or a prince who cares about effective rule, there should be no other concern than the warfare and how to prepare for the war. What are the effective method of conducting a war and winning them should be the only concern for the ruler. So, for a ruler concerned about the ruling, the only concern is constantly developing the military virtue or military capability. So, the warfare, and he also wrote a text called Art of War, is the necessary for the ruler to govern effectively. So, like he advised the prince that he should derive pleasure in hunting, because the hunting will develop his skill of warfare, killing and so on. So, he wanted the prince or the rulers to devote exclusively to warfare, and his Art of War also provides the significance of military virtue and warfare that Machiavelli associated with the preservation of the polity. So, there cannot be a proper defense or preservation of the existing polity or principalities without the army, without military virtue. So, he wanted the rulers to have their army in the auxiliaries or the citizens' armory and so on, and continuously seek to expand their territories. So, the advice that he gives to the prince or the future prince of the Italy is to seek constant acquiring or conquering of the new territories to expand his rule, to expand his principalities. And such expansion of territory could be achieved through the help of others' army too, but without the military power of one's own, there is no defense of the rule and for the principalities. So, it is through winning wars and gaining new territories or resources that a prince could aspire to achieve glory and command respect from the people. So, it is necessary for the ruler to seek new territories, to expand one's principalities, and military preparedness or the knowledge of warfare is the absolute necessary for the preservation of the principalities and also for the expansion of territories. Now, the next advice that he gives to the prince is to learn the virtue of lion and fox. So, it is similar to the Aristotle views on human nature, which if you recall that he consider human being as June politican. That means human beings are animal, but this animal is someone which wants to live in the community and also has a rational faculty and a sense of moral just or unjustness. So, like Aristotle, animal kingdom and species did guide Machiavelli's understanding of man's political world, which is full of treacherous or dubious actions and behaviors. So, Machiavelli regards human beings and their collective lives through the analogy of animals, life in the jungle or in the animal kingdom. And he differs from Aristotle in a sense. He is not taking any moral or ethical position to judge the human nature good and bad, moral, ethical, rational or irrational. His only concern is how to preserve the polity, how to govern effectively. And to govern effectively, he also wants the prince or the ruler to learn from the animal's behavior or animal's virtue or the characteristics. So, according to Machiavelli, to be successful, a prince must behave like particular animals. So, that particular animals is lion and the fox. So, for Machiavelli, why a ruler or a prince should imitate and learn from lion and fox is that a lion is easily trapped but not a fox, and a ruler must understand the trap with having the virtue of a fox. So, fox, because of the cunning behavior and the foresight or intuitiveness, is capable of protecting itself from the traps set by wolves and others. Similarly, a ruler to effectively rule must know when trap or the conspiracies are set for him by others. But he also should have the virtue of a lion to effectively fight, have the military virtue to fight in the open with the enemies. So, he advised the prince to combine the virtue of a lion by being bold, courageous and ruthless like a lion, with the virtue of a fox by being cunning and having foresight to preempt the deceptions and traps set by others. So, the political instabilities, political ruling is also simultaneously about the presence of evils or the treacherous behaviors of others. Now, for a ruler to preserve his rule and to govern effectively must have the boldness or the ruthlessness of a lion, but also the foresight to preempt the conspiracies and the traps set by others. So, for Machiavelli, a ruler or the prince must know how to act like a beast or a lion, and he should imitate both the fox and the lion, for the lion is liable to be trapped. So, lion is bold, assertive, ruthless, but it can be trapped, but the fox is not bold, not ruthless, but it is very difficult to trap a fox. So, for Machiavelli, a ruler or the prince must know how to act like a beast, and he should imitate both the fox and the lion, for the lion is liable to be trapped, whereas the fox cannot ward off the wolves. So, one needs then to be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten away the wolves. So, there is the kind of constant competitiveness or enviness in the polity, particularly from the aristocrats and the nobilities, who will constantly conspire against the ruler. Now, to rule effectively, a king or a prince must behave in a ruthless manner, in a bold manner, but he should also be aware of the traps and the conspiracies and learn and imitate it from the fox. So, thus Machiavelli recognizes the presence of evil in the political life of the nation, and he did not downplay or set aside its devastating consequences. So, in other political philosophers we find that they will not engage with the evils that is prevalent, that exist in the society, that is part of the human nature. He wants to engage with the evils and yet to ensure the order and how to govern the principalities effectively. That is the chief concern of Machiavelli, and in that advice he does not downplay or undermine the presence of evil that is there in the society and also in the human nature, and which has devastating consequences for the principalities. So, if a prince or the ruler is unaware of the traps and the conspiracies, it will bring ruins to his rule or principalities. So, advise the king to learn the art of manipulation by being ruthless and having the knowledge to understand the traps set by others to rule and govern effectively. So, men in politics are like wolves whom a prince could tackle by combining the virtue of lion and fox. So, political events are always in flux, and a king must be flexible enough to adapt to the changing circumstances to be successful. So, that is the reason why he wanted the prince and the rulers to be like a lion or the fox, to have the attributes or the virtue that combines the virtue of the lion or the fox. So, this is to rule effectively, and to rule effectively is to understand the evils, the treacherous behaviors of others, and to respond to them effectively one need to have the virtue of the lion and also that of the fox. So, this is also to do with the changing nature of the political life, where there is the constant traps or the conspiracies to the rulers or to the king set by the others, particularly those who are nobles and aristocrats, who will always be envious to a prince. So, to respond to different situations and the necessity of different situation in an appropriate manner, a king must be flexible enough to know when to be ruthless and when to be generous, and to do that he needs to have the virtue of both lion and fox. The next is about the use of violence, and according to Selden Wallin, Machiavelli is a theorist of the economy of violence. So, violence is necessary for effectively ruling, and he want the prince to be ruthless. So, in the statecraft, Machiavellian theory is also regarded by Selden Wallin as the theorist of the economy of violence. So, considering the wickedness of man, Machiavelli regarded violence as inevitable and even justified to secure the state, to defend the state. So, without violence it is very difficult to rule effectively. So, however, such use of force must be reasonable or judicious. So, in Machiavelli theory, the use of violence is not just for the sake of it, but it must serve certain political ends or for the preservation of the state. So, Machiavelli makes a difference between the appearance and the actual nature of the prince, and he is the one who is regarded as the theorist of manipulation. And in the politics, this art of manipulation is necessary for the success of the ruler or the prince who want to govern effectively. So, he wanted the king to have the appearance of a loving and caring ruler than a ruthless one. So, it is always good for the prince to have the appearance, or a ruler to have the appearance that he or she is benevolent or caring for the people, but he should also be ruthless. However, the appearance of being trustworthy or being caring or loving is helpful for the ruler in the long term for the preservation of the state. So, it makes him trustworthy and commands obedience from the people. However, when the situation demands the prince or ruler to use violence ruthlessly, he should not hesitate, and that is the necessary responsibility for a ruler to become caring or loving for the people if it helps him to preserve the state, to maintain the security of the state. But if the situation demands him to behave ruthlessly or to use violence, he should not hesitate. So, a king's action for Machiavelli is judged not based on the means, whether it is moral or ethical that he deploy, but the consequences that it brings. So, therefore, the famous dictum that ends justify the means. So, according to Machiavelli, the good and glory of the state is what matters for a king. So, any action he does or he does not is judged on the basis of consequences it brings, not on the basis of the means he deploys. So, anything for the preservation of the state is justified in Machiavelli's thinking or theorization. So, Machiavelli spends considerable time in The Prince arguing that how generosity and kindness had ruined various rulers in the past, and thus he wanted the future kings to be cautious about being generous and kind, and it is better to be ruthless than kind and generous. So, thus he wanted the ruler to be loved by the people. However, in the long run, it is only good for the ruler and the principalities if he is feared, he here is the prince or the ruler, than loved. So, according to Machiavelli, if a ruler has to choose between being loved and being feared, he should prefer to being feared than loved, but should not be hated or despised by the people. So, here is a kind of economy of violence, as Selden Wallin said, that first is that violence is necessary for ruling effectively. Now, such deployment of violence is not justified for the sake of it. Only when it helps the preservation of the state or the welfare of the state, violence is justified. Now, a ruler must know the art of manipulation by appearing as loving and caring, because it helps the citizen to have respect or have trust in his rule and prevent rebellious activities. But it is good for a king in the long term to be feared, or in other words, if he has to choose between loved and being feared, he should always choose feared than the love. Now, the final points that we are going to discuss in this lecture is his views on politics and religion and role of religion in politics. So, although Machiavelli argued for an independent and the secular sphere of politics, so he was the first who said that the morality and the ethics that govern the political sphere should be different from the morality and ethics that governs the conventional Christian lives. So, although Machiavelli argued for an independent and secular sphere of politics, he also recognized the use of religion in preserving the state and binding the people together in obedience to prevent rebellions. So, for Machiavelli, religion can serve the purpose of the state in bringing the people together and then inculcate in them the value of obedience, and thereby prevent any kind of rebellious activities or upheavals or threat to the existing rule and principalities. So, much of his discussion on religion is in Discourse on Levy, however, it also guides his argument in The Prince. So, strangely he recognizes the value of religion given his critique of Christianity and its pieties. So, he was the ruthless critique of anything associated with the Catholic Church. So, all the immoral activities or lavish life which resulted in the conspiracies or political instabilities in Italy, he associated with the Catholic Church or the papacy. So, considering his critique to Christianity and its pieties, it is very strange that he also acknowledged the role of religion in politics or the value of religion in politics. So, Machiavelli associated the Catholic Church with all the corrupt practices and political and moral decay that was prevalent in Italy. So, he argued that Christianity and its ethics teaches man or individuals to be otherworldly. They should not bother about their temporal or present life, and it also teach them to be humble or docile in their behavior in the face of trouble, because the otherworldly or the life after death is more important than this life or this present life. So, such teachings or such ethics in Christianity, according to Machiavelli, resulted in the lack of necessary political and military virtue among the citizens to defend the republics. So, the reason for the lack of necessary political and military virtue, which enables the man to create a society or to govern it effectively, is lacking because of this Christian ethics or morality of being humble, thinking about the other world, or also being docile and truthful to the God. So, in Machiavelli there is a kind of return of the Greek classical political theory, if you like. So, in Plato and Aristotle, what was the argument? The argument is that human being through his reason or intellect can not only govern his life effectively, but also the collective life of the city or the community can be better governed through reason and rationality. So, prior to that there was the reliance on the natural forces or maybe mythological figures and forces. But the classical Greek political philosophers argued that human beings through their reason can govern themselves and also the city states. However, in the Christianity with the Saint Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, we have seen that how they argued that it is not possible for the human being to lead a life truthfully only through the basis of reason, and therefore they must subject to the will of God or the religion. Machiavelli again is bringing back that classical traits that human beings can, through reason, by developing the political and moral virtue, govern the principalities effectively. And the identification in Machiavelli is then the corrupting influence of Christianity and Christian ethics, which makes human being docile, weak, and subject to the will of the God or the circumstances. Machiavelli wanted the human beings to develop the political and military virtue to master the circumstances, to control the circumstances, to govern the city effectively, and to bring back glory, which is humanly possible, in contrast to the Christian ethics, which says that it is not for the human being to live a life of redemption. It is only possible when the God willing and God grants redemptions to the chosen few, depending upon their ethical, honest, moral behavior and so on. So, there is a kind of tussle between Machiavellian ethics or understanding of human nature and the church, and this resulted in the banning or prohibiting of his text Prince in 1559. So, the Catholic Church prohibit the reading of the Prince in 1559. So, if you remember, he wrote this text in 1513. It was published after his death in 1527, in 1531 or 32, and in 1559 church banned this text, and much of the Machiavellian crude caricaturing of the politics is based on this negative understanding of the text. So, Machiavelli argued about the role of religion, but not in the sense of a kind of system of truth that it provides, but a political purpose it can serve. So, Machiavelli argued about the two kinds of morality, which is public and private morality, and the private lives of the citizens should be governed by the conventional morality and the Christian religious ethics. So, in the private life of the citizen, the conventional morality and the Christian religious ethics is necessary, even desirable, for the sustenance of the rule. So, but it should not guide the action of the prince, and Machiavelli writes that, and this is very important in Machiavelli's take on the religion and how a prince should not subject himself or his action to the dictates of religion. He writes that, for when the safety of one's country wholly depends on the decision to be taken, no attention should be paid either to justice or injustice, to kindness or cruelty, or to its being praiseworthy or ignominious. On the contrary, every other consideration being set aside, that alternative should be wholeheartedly adopted, which will save the life and preserve the freedom of one's country. So, the central or this major task for a ruler or the prince is to preserve the country and thereby defend the freedom of its people. Now, in defending the country and preserving the freedom of its people, a ruler should use the religion if it helps in such preservation and defending the freedom of the people. However, in acting upon those decisions, he should not be guided by the justness or unjustness, cruelty or the kindness, or the praiseworthiness of his action or its moral repugnant nature. Only consideration is the preservation of them. So, whether it is moral or immoral, kind or cruel, praiseworthy or ignominious, a ruler must take only those actions which helps in the preservation of the state and defense of the freedom of the country. So, thus Machiavelli does not regard religion as a system of truth. Its value lie in the preservation of the state and serving its purpose. So, hence he wanted to subordinate the role of religion in politics. So, there is this subordinate role for the religion in politics to serve the preservation of the state. So, Machiavelli spent considerable time in The Prince on cruelty and mercy. Is it better to be loved than feared, or the reverse? So, Machiavelli's treatise on politics, or whether it is good or desirable for the prince to be kind or cruel, he spent considerable time in chapter 17 to answer this question, and it is unambiguous response that we find in Machiavelli. And he says that a prince, to hold his position, must acquire the power to be not good and understand when to use it and when not to use it. And the whole virtue, so to say, is dependent on this understanding for a ruler or the prince when to become kind or when to become cruel. And it is necessary or even justified to be feared or cruel than being kind or generous, because the task of a ruler or the prince is the preservation of the state, and the preservation of a state alone can ensure the freedom of the people and their welfare. So, the only thing that should bother or concern the ruler is the preservation of the state, and in preserving the state all moral, immoral, just, unjust, kind, cruel action is justified. So, although Machiavelli advised to the prince to deploy all means, moral or immoral, to defend the principalities, he advised the ruler not to make the common people his enemy, and that is his advice to the prince, that the prince should not make the common people his enemy. If the common peoples are his enemy, it will be a threat to his rule in the long term. So, in comparison to aristocrats or nobility who are prone to conspiracies against him, that is the ruler, the prince should seek friendship with the common people in the long run, and that is the advice which is unique in Machiavelli, which you do not find in others. So, in conventional understanding, there is nothing to be learned from the common people, and in fact, the Platonic idea, if you think of mobocracy or democracy as the perverted form, because the multitude do not know what is good and what is desirable, and they are not trustworthy. Here in Machiavelli you find that he advised the prince to seek friendship from the common people than from the aristocrats and the nobility, which is constantly envious or involved in the conspiracies against the rule. And the reason being that the aristocrats and the nobilities often treat the ruler as one among them and constantly envy the exalted position that the king or the prince enjoy. However, the masses will see him in the exalted position and respect him and defend his principalities if it ensure their welfare, and therefore he advised the king not to take the property from the people and expand the territories or the principalities through winning the war, and not by extracting revenues and resources from their people. So, the nobles or aristocracy may betray or deceive the king, but the citizens would keep him in exalted high esteem and respect him truly, and therefore a prince must seek friendship with the people in the long run rather than nobility and the aristocrats. So, he could not be secured if the people are his enemy. So, the threat, and there is the kind of ethical sense here also, that a ruthless ruler is desirable or justified so long such ruthlessness is for the preservation of the state, for the defense of the state. But if he is hated by the people or despised by the people, it will lead to upheavals, it will lead to rebellions, and a ruler or a prince must know that it is good to be ruthless, but it is not good, not desirable to be despised and hated by the people. So, he should not make the people enemy, that is the advice that he gives. So, in his deployment of violence, which according to Machiavelli is necessary and even justified, the prince should consider that he should be feared but not despised or hated by the people. So, that is the advice that he gives to the prince. So, Machiavelli political theory, if we conclude, is a theory which acknowledges the existence of evil and wickedness of man, and Machiavellian brand of politics is often associated with treachery, dubiousness or immoral activities. However, he justified these means not for their own sake, but to establish and maintain order or peace in the polity that would allow the people to live a secure life. So, all the negative connotation that we associate with Machiavellian politics is justified by Machiavelli not for their own sake, but so long as it helps the ruler to preserve his rule and govern the principalities effectively. So, how to establish a rule with the autonomy of politics in which human beings can live peacefully is the central concern of Machiavelli political theory, that human beings peaceful life is possible when, or prosperous life is possible when the ruling is done by the effective ruler with the knowledge of what to do when, and this knowledge of what to do when for the preservation of nation state is something which is the central concern for Machiavelli. Even the immediate concern for him, considering his desire or patriotism to reunite the different republics or principalities in the Italian peninsula and bring back the Roman republican form of ruling or the glory that was there in the past. So, overall Machiavellian political theory is about the preservation of the state, defense of the state, and that will lead to the peaceful prosperous life for the people. And in preservation and defense of the state, therefore, all moral, ethical, just, unjust considerations should be set aside and everything should be done to preserve the state, to protect the state. That is the basic moral or if you like distinct, unique understanding of morality or virtue in Machiavellian thought and central concern of his political philosophy. So, that is all in today's lecture. The themes that we have covered, you can refer to these texts like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present, and Gary Browning, A History of Modern Political Thought, is also a good interpretation of Machiavelli. Murray Forsyth and Maurice Kensopper, A Guide to Political Classics, is also a good text. Similarly, Sefali Jha, Western Political Thought from Ancient Greeks to Modern Times, is a good text to understand some of the themes that we have discussed today. You should also read this text, The Prince by Machiavelli, which is edited by Peter Bondanella, published by Oxford University Press, and this is a very thin text, less than 100 pages, to understand for your own thinking or judgment about the advice that he gives to the prince and how far that is applicable in our present condition, or to understand the politics in our present time. So, this text you should refer to if you are interested to know about the Machiavellian advice, which is less than 100 pages, and it will give you enough scope into the thinking and advice that Machiavelli gives to the prince, and you can arrive at your own understanding, your own reading of Machiavelli, and should not be guided by the crude caricature understanding of Machiavellian politics and so on. And you should also refer to James Allen Wren on Politics, A History of Political Thought from Herodotus to the Present. So, that is all for today's lecture. Do share your comments and feedbacks, we will be happy to hear and respond to. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.